Do you remember those breakfasts that once filled Southern kitchens with the smell of grits, biscuits, and sizzling skillets? The kind of meals you'd find in old family cookbooks, passed down by memory rather than measurements. These dishes carried families through hard times, turning scraps and leftovers into comfort that lasted all day. How did we let those breakfasts slip away from our tables? Hot water, cornbread and molasses. Picture it. A sleepy morning in the rural South, the sun barely stretching across the fields, and somebody's grandmother already at the stove, a cast iron skillet heating with just enough oil to shimmer. Hot water cornbread was never meant to be fancy. It was survival food, born from times when wheat flour was scarce, yeast was a luxury, and cornmeal, cheap, filling, and plentiful, was the heartbeat of the pantry. The hot water part wasn't just practical, it was ingenious. Boiling water scalded the cornmeal, creating a sticky dough that held together when fried, transforming into golden little patties, crisp at the edges and soft within. Ingredients were humble, the kind you didn't have to run to a store for. Plain cornmeal, salt, hot water, and maybe a spoonful of lard if you were lucky. Preparation was as quick as it was frugal. You stirred, patted, and dropped the cakes into hot oil until they sang. The smell would drift through the house, warm and nutty, announcing breakfast better than any alarm clock. Served hot, these little rounds begged for sweetness, and that's where molasses entered the scene. Molasses was the sweetener of the poor, thick and earthy, cheaper than refined sugar. A drizzle, or sometimes a full-on soak, turned cornbread from simple starch into a comfort meal, one that stuck with you through a morning of hard labor or schoolyard games. Ask anyone who grew up with it, and their voice softens. Hot water, cornbread with molasses wasn't just food, it was memory on a plate. Today, it's rare to see this duo outside of church suppers or family reunions. In a world of brunch menus boasting maple-infused brioche, hot water cornbread and molasses feel almost rebellious. An old recipe whispering, "We made do and we made it delicious." Hoe cakes, slave pancakes. How cakes carry a name that tells their story before a bite is even taken. Born in the fields of the American South, these simple cornmeal pancakes were first cooked on the flat side of a hoe blade held over an open fire. Enslaved Africans, denied proper kitchens and tools, turned whatever they had into makeshift cookware. The result was something that was both resourceful and enduring. Thin, crisp-edged cakes made from cornmeal, salt, water, and maybe a splash of fat if there was any to spare. They weren't delicate like the fluffy stacks you'll find in diners today, but they had a rustic charm, hearty enough to fuel back-breaking labor, yet comforting in their warmth. To make them, cornmeal was mixed with boiling water until it thickened, then patted into thin rounds and slapped onto a greased hoe, or later, a skillet. The batter sizzled, sending up a nutty aroma that clung to the air. Often they were eaten plain, but sometimes drizzled with molasses or paired with scraps of salt pork. They were versatile, portable, and quick, qualities that made them essential to survival. In their simplicity was ingenuity, turning meager rations into something nourishing and even satisfying. How cakes lingered long after slavery, becoming a staple in African American kitchens during Reconstruction and into the Depression years. Families passed down recipes, though no one ever wrote them down. Your grandmother simply knew by feel how much cornmeal and water to mix. Today, you might stumble upon a recipe in a soul food cookbook, or see them revived at a Southern food festival, but they're far from common at the breakfast table. Compared to TikTok's endless pancake hacks, protein powders, whipped cottage cheese, rainbow sprinkles, the hoe cake feels defiantly old school, a reminder of resilience served hot and golden from a skillet. Chitterling scramble. If breakfast is supposed to be the most important meal of the day, then the chitterling scramble is proof that importance once meant survival, not spectacle. Chitterlings, pig intestines, cleaned with care and stewed for hours, were the kind of ingredient born of necessity. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were often given the scraps of the hog, but through patience and seasoning, those scraps became the centerpiece of unforgettable meals. The scramble was one of those quiet inventions. Leftover chitterlings chopped fine, folded into eggs, onions, and peppers, sometimes stretched with a bit of rice or potatoes if the pantry was thin. It was hearty, aromatic, and a way of ensuring nothing went to waste. Preparation was never glamorous. The chitterlings had to be scrubbed, boiled, and seasoned until tender, which made them more of a weekend job than a quick weekday fix. Once cooked, though, they could be diced and stored, ready to be tossed into a skillet with beaten eggs. The result was a dish that was at once rustic and luxurious, rich with the savory depth of pork, and brightened by whatever vegetables were on hand. Hot sauce was a near requirement, giving the scramble that familiar kick that woke you up faster than coffee. For those who grew up with it, the smell of a chitterling scramble is etched into memory, a Sunday morning soundtrack right alongside gospel on the radio. It wasn't just breakfast, it was culture on a plate, resilience disguised as indulgence. These days, you won't see it trending on Instagram Reels, and you're more likely to hear jokes about chitterlings than see someone cooking them. But in an era when nose-to-tail eating has become fashionable among foodies, the chitterling scramble feels like the original, unpretentious version. A recipe that whispers, "We've been doing this all along." Fried apples with cornmeal mush. Long before apple pie overnight oats made its debut on Instagram, there was fried apples with cornmeal mush, a breakfast that stretched simple ingredients into something both filling and soulful. Cornmeal mush was a cornerstone of African American kitchens, a cousin of polenta, boiled until thick, and then left to set into a firm slab. Once chilled, it could be sliced and fried in a pan until golden and crisp on the outside, tender within. Add to that a skillet of apples, softened in butter or lard and dusted with sugar and cinnamon if the cupboard allowed. And you had a breakfast that felt indulgent even when money was scarce. The genius of the dish was in its practicality. Cornmeal was cheap, apples were abundant in many rural communities, and both could be stored through lean seasons. Frying the mush gave it a second life, turning yesterday's porridge into today's hot, crunchy base. The apples, simmered until they released their syrupy juices, acted like a sauce, soaking into the cornmeal and marrying sweetness with grainy savor. It was proof that comfort didn't have to come from plenty. It could be born from leftovers and a little imagination. For many families, this breakfast carried the aroma of home. Children would hover near the stove, waiting for the moment the apples began to caramelize, their scent mingling with the nutty crackle of cornmeal and hot grease. The dish was warming, hearty enough to power a day in the fields or a long walk to school, yet simple enough to be repeated often without complaint. Today, it's almost disappeared, eclipsed by toaster pastries and frozen waffles. Yet with modern foodies rediscovering fried polenta and baked fruit compotes, fried apples with cornmeal mush deserves a revival. It's rustic, comforting, and undeniably timeless. Grandmother's ingenuity plated like a feast. Hog maw and grits. Hog maw and grits is one of those breakfasts that tells the story of resilience in every bite. Hog maw, the lining of a pig's stomach, was never the prized cut of the animal. Like chitterlings, it was part of the scrap basket handed down to enslaved Africans and later to poor families across the South. Yet what some dismissed as waste became the foundation of a dish that was rich in flavor, heavy in sustenance, and unforgettable in memory. Paired with grits, those coarse-ground corn kernels simmered until creamy, hog maw became something greater than the sum of its parts. A breakfast that stuck to your ribs and reminded you of the power of making do. Preparing hog maw was no casual task. It had to be scrubbed, rinsed, and boiled for hours until tender, often with onions, garlic, and a heavy dose of seasoning to bring out its best. Once cooked, it could be chopped and fried in a skillet, its savory richness balanced by the soft, porridge-like grits beside it. The contrast was what made the meal work. The chew of the hog maw against the silky spoonfuls of grits, with maybe a splash of hot sauce or a knob of butter melting on top. For many families, this was the kind of breakfast served on special mornings, a break from the everyday simplicity of plain grits or cornbread. It carried the scent of community gatherings and the sound of voices in the kitchen, and it stood as a reminder that flavor could be coaxed from even the most unlikely ingredients. Today, hog maw rarely appears on a breakfast plate, its reputation eclipsed by quicker, trendier options. Yet when chefs talk about nose-to-tail eating, they echo what African-American cooks knew all along. Nothing was wasted, and everything had a purpose. Cowpeas and rice morning bowl. Before overnight oats and smoothie bowls claimed the breakfast spotlight, there was the humble cowpeas and rice morning bowl. Born out of African traditions and carried into the kitchens of enslaved people in the American South, this dish was both a nod to heritage and a means of survival. Cowpeas, close cousins to black-eyed peas, were a staple crop, resilient in poor soil and packed with protein. Paired with rice, another African import that thrived in the low-country fields of the Carolinas and Georgia, they created a meal that was simple, sustaining, and deeply symbolic of cultural endurance. The preparation was straightforward but always seasoned with care. Cowpeas were boiled until tender, often with onions, salt pork, or a ham bone if the household had one to spare. Rice simmered alongside, absorbing every bit of broth and flavor. When combined in a bowl, the result was a creamy, hearty breakfast that could stretch across an entire family. It wasn't flashy, but it was reliable. Exactly what was needed before a long day in the fields or in domestic work. A drizzle of hot sauce or a spoonful of molasses might be added, depending on taste, but the heart of the dish was in its comforting balance of legumes and grains. For many, cowpeas and rice carried echoes of home, a link to ancestral memory. It was the kind of food that didn't just fill the belly, but told a story of resilience and adaptation. Today, you'll more likely encounter its cousin, Poppin' John, served as a New Year's dish, promising luck and prosperity. But as a breakfast staple, it has nearly vanished, forgotten in a world of drive-through egg sandwiches and protein shakes. The cowpeas and rice morning bowl deserves recognition as the original power breakfast, centuries ahead of modern wellness trends. Buttermilk biscuits with syrup. SOP. There was a time when breakfast didn't come in branded boxes or drive-through bags. but rose warm and fragrant from the oven in the form of buttermilk biscuits. Soft, flaky, and golden, biscuits were the pride of many African American kitchens, especially when money was tight but ingenuity was endless. The trick was in the buttermilk, often soured milk saved from the day before, which gave the dough its tang and tenderness. Mixed with flour, lard, and a touch of baking soda, the dough came together quickly, shaped by hand and baked until they split open with steam. But what made these biscuits truly shine was the syrup sop. Syrup sop wasn't complicated, but it was genius in its simplicity. A pan of homemade or store-bought syrup, cane syrup, sorghum, or molasses, depending on what was at hand, was warmed until runny and thin. Freshly baked biscuits were split and dunked directly into the syrup, soaking up sweetness in their pillowy layers. The act of sopping was more than eating. It was ritual, a moment of indulgence at a table where resources were scarce. But flavor was never lacking. Children loved it for the sticky sweetness, adults loved it for the comfort, and everyone loved it because it felt like home. In memory, the combination of warm biscuit and syrup feels almost decadent, though it was born out of frugality. It stretched limited ingredients into something satisfying, turning a humble biscuit into a feast. Today, syrup sop has all but vanished, replaced by biscuit sandwiches stuffed with bacon and egg, or overshadowed by trendy brunch menus. But there's something timeless in the image of a kitchen table, a plate of biscuits, and a jar of syrup ready to be sopped. It's breakfast as it once was, simple, sweet, and filled with love. Salt pork and fried hominy. Salt pork and fried hominy is the kind of breakfast that tells on itself. It wasn't about extravagance, it was about stretching what you had and making it count. Salt pork, heavily cured and salted to keep from spoiling, was once a backbone ingredient in African American kitchens, especially in rural communities where refrigeration was non-existent. Fried hominy, on the other hand, was corn transformed, kernels soaked and hulled to become hearty little pearls that could be fried up golden and crisp. When the two met in a skillet, they created a dish that was smoky, salty, crunchy, and satisfying. The very definition of frugal comfort food. The preparation was as straightforward as it gets. Salt pork was sliced thin and rendered in a heavy pan, its fat sizzling into a base for whatever followed. Into that hot fat went the hominy, drained and patted dry so it would crisp instead of steam. Stirred together, the two built layers of flavor, the chewy bite of pork balanced by the earthy crunch of fried corn. Sometimes onions were tossed in, sometimes a sprinkle of pepper, but most often the dish stood plain, its strength lying in its simplicity. For those who grew up on it, this breakfast wasn't just food, it was a memory of hands working early in the morning, of kitchens where smoke hung heavy and the day's work loomed large. It was filling enough to fuel hours of labor, cheap enough to repeat day after day, and beloved enough that even children would sneak bites straight from the skillet. Now, fried hominy has been rebranded as a gourmet side in trendy restaurants, and pork belly is sold at a premium. Yet salt pork and fried hominy together remain a reminder that yesterday's make-do meals are often the tastiest ones of all. Sweet potato biscuits. Sweet potato biscuits carry the warmth of memory in every bite. They weren't just bread on the table. They were a bridge between necessity and celebration. Sweet potatoes were abundant in the South, storing well through the winter and providing both sweetness and substance when other ingredients were scarce. Mixed into biscuit dough, they brought color, moisture, and a soft sweetness that made each bite feel like a treat, even when times were lean. For African American families, they were a symbol of resourcefulness, a way to take something humble and transform it into something that felt almost luxurious. The process was simple but soulful. Leftover sweet potatoes, often roasted or boiled the night before, were mashed smooth and folded into flour, lard, a bit of baking powder, and a splash of milk or buttermilk. The dough was kneaded lightly, patted down, and cut into rounds before being slipped into a hot oven. As they baked, the kitchen filled with a sweet, earthy aroma that announced breakfast better than any alarm clock. When pulled out golden and steaming, the biscuits split open like little gifts, ready for a smear of butter, a drizzle of molasses, or simply enjoyed as they were. For many, sweet potato biscuits were tied to Sunday mornings, holidays, or visits from relatives. They were comfort disguised as simplicity, proof that even in times of hardship, flavor and love could rise like dough in the oven. Children remember sneaking one straight from the pan, too hot to hold, too tempting to wait. Today, sweet potato biscuits have nearly disappeared from everyday breakfasts, overshadowed by canned biscuits and frozen waffles. Yet when food enthusiasts praise farm-to-table dining or celebrate heritage recipes, they're echoing the same truth these biscuits once proved. The best dishes are born from what the earth gives and what the heart makes of it. Fatback gravy over rice. Fatback gravy over rice is the kind of breakfast that proves necessity is often the mother of invention, and sometimes of incredible flavor. Fatback, the salted and cured strip of pork taken from beneath the pig's skin, was one of those cuts handed down when choice meats were scarce. What it lacked in elegance, it made up for in richness. Rendered in a skillet, fatback released a savory essence that became the base for a simple but unforgettable gravy. Poured steaming over a bowl of rice, it turned a handful of pantry staples into a dish that could fuel long hours in the fields or at the mill. The preparation followed the same rhythm across many kitchens. First, the fatback was fried until it released its oil and browned into chewy little nuggets. A bit of flour went into the pan to thicken the drippings, followed by milk or water, whisked until smooth and bubbling. What emerged was a peppery, salty gravy, rich enough to transform plain rice into a breakfast feast. Families often stretched this gravy to cover more bowls than seemed possible because waste was unthinkable and mouths were many. Beyond its practicality, fatback gravy over rice carried a certain comfort. It was a dish that brought people together around the table, no matter how modest the setting. Children remember scraping bowls clean. Adults recall the aroma that filled the kitchen. And everyone knew that for a moment, hunger was held at bay by thrift turned delicious. Today, you rarely see this dish outside of old family cookbooks or whispered memories. In a world where brunch means eggs, Benedict, and latte art, fatback gravy feels out of place. Yet it deserves its recognition. It's a reminder that flavor isn't always found in luxury. It's often hidden in what we once overlooked. Fish and grits, pre-soul food diner style. Long before fish and grits became a polished plate on soul food diner menus, it lived as a humble breakfast in coastal communities where African American families turned the day's catch into the morning's sustenance. Fresh fish wasn't a luxury there, it was survival. Whatever could be pulled from the river or coast found its way onto the table, often pan-fried in lard or bacon grease until the edges crackled golden. Paired with a bowl of slow-cooked grits, creamy and steaming, the dish was hearty, affordable, and deeply tied to place. The preparation was straightforward, shaped by what was available. Small croakers, mullet, whiting, or even catfish might be dredged lightly in cornmeal and salt before hitting the skillet. While the fish cooked, grits bubbled patiently on the back burner, sometimes enriched with a pat of butter or a splash of milk if the household could spare it. When brought together, the contrast was perfect. Crispy fish against soft, mellow grits. The flavors tied together with nothing more than black pepper or a dash of hot sauce. It wasn't about presentation, but practicality, a meal built to nourish before the day's labor began. For those who grew up with it, fish and grits tasted like home. It carried the smell of salt water and smoke, the sounds of a skillet popping, the memory of family gathered before scattering to fields, boats, or mills. It was a breakfast that honored both land and water, a blend of cultures and traditions preserved through taste. Now, when fish and grits appear on restaurant menus, they often arrive stacked high with shrimp or dressed in cream sauces, far removed from their origins. Yet the essence remains, a dish born of resourcefulness, made from what was near, turning simplicity into sustenance and memory into flavor. Red-eye gravy with ham drippings. Red-eye gravy is one of those dishes that feels like a secret passed down from the Old South, a little bit of culinary alchemy born out of thrift. At its heart, it was nothing more than ham drippings and black coffee, two ingredients that sound like they don't belong together, but somehow make perfect sense. For African American families, especially in rural communities where every scrap had to count, this gravy was a way to stretch a single slice of ham into a full meal. Poured over grits, rice, or biscuits, it turned what might have been a meager breakfast into something filling and deeply flavorful. The preparation was simple and quick, the kind of thing you could do while the rest of the house stirred awake. After frying a slice of cured country ham, the drippings were left sizzling in the skillet, dark and salty. Instead of discarding them, a splash of strong, hot coffee was poured in, deglazing the pan and pulling up all the browned bits clinging to the surface. What emerged was a thin, smoky sauce with a bitter edge, one that soaked into whatever starch it touched. Some cooks added a bit of sugar to mellow the bite, while others leaned into the sharpness, preferring their gravy bold and bracing. To eat red-eye gravy was to embrace a kind of resourceful honesty. Nothing was wasted, and everything had a purpose. It was a working person's breakfast, meant to wake you up and keep you moving. Today, it's more likely to be found on a nostalgic Southern diner menu than in everyday kitchens, but it still carries the spirit of its origins. Red-eye gravy reminds us that frugality doesn't mean flavorless, and sometimes the simplest pairings linger the longest. Rice cakes with sorghum syrup. Rice cakes with sorghum syrup may not sound like much to a modern ear, especially when rice cake brings to mind those dry, crunchy discs from the health food aisle. But in African American kitchens of the past, rice cakes were something far richer and more comforting. They were born in the South, where rice was not only plentiful, but also deeply tied to African food traditions carried across the Atlantic. Leftover rice never went to waste. It was mixed with eggs, a little flour, maybe a splash of milk, and fried in a skillet until crisp on the outside and tender inside. Served hot, they were sweetened with sorghum syrup, a thick, dark sweetener that poured like molasses but with a flavor all its own, earthy, grassy, and deeply southern. The process was as practical as it was ingenious. Families knew how to stretch every grain of rice, turning yesterday's dinner into today's breakfast without complaint. The cakes were spooned into sizzling fat, browning into golden patties that hissed and crackled as they cooked. Once stacked on a plate, they begged for sorghum syrup, which soaked into the warm cakes and pooled around the edges, creating a dish that was humble yet indulgent. For children, this breakfast meant sticky fingers and full bellies. For adults, it meant nothing went to waste and everyone could eat before a long day. The taste of sorghum syrup in particular was unforgettable, a flavor tied to fields and farms where cane was crushed and boiled into liquid gold. Today, rice cakes in this form have almost disappeared, and sorghum syrup itself has become something of a rarity outside the South. Yet the memory of this dish lingers, a reminder that breakfast once celebrated thrift, tradition, and sweetness drawn straight from the land. Scrapple. Scrapple is one of those dishes that raises eyebrows today, but once stood as a shining example of resourcefulness. Originally rooted in the mid-Atlantic, where African-American cooks absorbed and transformed the traditions of German and Dutch settlers, scrapple was all about using what was left of the hog after butchering. Nothing went to waste, not the head, the trimmings, or the odds and ends that more privileged tables might have discarded. These parts were boiled down into a rich broth, finely chopped or ground, then blended with cornmeal, flour, and seasoning. Once set into a loaf, the mixture could be sliced and fried, turning scraps into a golden, crispy breakfast centerpiece. The genius of scrapple lay in its balance. On the outside, fried slices crackled in hot grease, their edges crisp and browned. Inside, the texture stayed soft, savory, and meaty, with hints of sage and pepper carrying through each bite. It was cheap, filling, and versatile, served with eggs, grits, or simply on its own. Many swore by topping it with molasses or syrup, letting sweetness mingle with the salty richness, while others stuck with plain ketchup or hot sauce. For African-American families living in working-class communities, scrapple wasn't just about thrift. It was about survival with dignity. A loaf could be made ahead, stretched across several meals, and transformed from scraps into something worth looking forward to. Memories of waking up to the smell of scrapple frying in a skillet are etched into countless childhoods, each slice proof of how nothing was wasted in kitchens where creativity ruled. Today, scrapple sits in a strange space, beloved in pockets of the mid-Atlantic yet misunderstood elsewhere, often dismissed as mystery meat. But in truth, it was the original nose-to-tail cooking, long before foodies made it trendy again. Scrapple whispered resilience in every bite. Cracklin' bread breakfast. Cracklin' bread breakfast is one of those meals that makes you wonder how anyone ever thought of it in the first place, until you remember that necessity drives invention. Cracklins, the crispy bits of pork skin and fat left over from rendering lard, were far too precious to waste. Tossed into cornbread batter, they transformed a plain loaf into something rich, savory, and celebratory. For African-American families in the rural South, cracklin' bread wasn't just food. It was a marker of resourcefulness and, at times, a small luxury. When served at breakfast, sliced warm from the pan, it turned an ordinary morning into something memorable. The preparation was simple but deliberate. Cornmeal formed the base, stirred together with buttermilk, baking soda, and a bit of lard or grease. Then came the star of the show, the cracklins, folded into the batter so that each bite promised a salty, crunchy surprise. Baked in a cast-iron skillet, the bread emerged golden, with edges so crisp they could almost shatter under a knife. At the breakfast table, it was eaten alongside eggs, collard greens left from the night before, or even just a drizzle of cane syrup to balance the salt with sweetness. What made crackling bread special wasn't just the taste, though it was unforgettable, but the feeling it carried. It spoke of community hog killings, when neighbors gathered to process meat for the winter, ensuring nothing went unused. For children, it was the thrill of biting into the chewy, salty nuggets hidden inside the crumb. For adults, it was a reminder of thrift and skill turned into flavor. Today, crackling bread has almost vanished from breakfast menus, remembered mostly in family kitchens or Southern cookbooks. Yet it deserves a revival, standing as proof that the humblest leftovers can create a meal worth celebrating. Turnip green omelet. The turnip green omelet is a breakfast that tells a story of thrift and ingenuity, where the garden and the skillet met in perfect harmony. Turnip greens were a staple in African American households, especially in rural communities where every edible leaf was valued. They were tough, bitter, and abundant. But with the right touch of seasoning and thyme, they transformed into something nourishing and flavorful. Folding them into eggs was not only practical but inventive, stretching limited ingredients into a breakfast that could feed more mouths without stretching the wallet. Preparation often began with leftover greens from the night before. Stewed with onions, garlic, or a bit of salt pork, the greens carried deep, smoky flavor. Chopped and reheated in a skillet, they were joined by beaten eggs poured over the top, cooking low and slow until the mixture set. Sometimes the omelet was flipped, sometimes folded, and sometimes it was less an omelet and more a rustic scramble, depending on who was at the stove and how hungry the family was. Either way, it was hearty, savory, and sustaining, often served with a side of cornbread or grits. The turnip green omelet carried emotional weight far beyond its ingredients. It was the taste of survival food turned delicious, of mothers and grandmothers proving that nothing from the garden would go to waste. Children might groan at the sight of greens at dinner, but tucked into eggs at breakfast, they became something softer, something easier to love. In today's world of kale smoothies and spinach frittatas, the turnip green omelet feels like an overlooked ancestor. What food bloggers might now call farm to table, older generations called simply making breakfast. And in its humble, earthy way, this dish remains a quiet testament to resilience and creativity in the kitchen. Oatmeal with cane syrup, not Quaker instant. Before microwaves and instant packets promised breakfast in 90 seconds, oatmeal with cane syrup was the kind of slow, steady meal that filled both the belly and the house with warmth. Rolled oats were not yet the quick cooking kind. They simmered on the stove, bubbling in a pot of water or milk until they softened into a thick, creamy porridge. African American families often flavored it not with brown sugar or store-bought syrups, but with cane syrup. That dark, glossy liquid born from boiling sugarcane juice down to its sweetest, richest essence. A drizzle was enough to turn a simple pot of oats into something memorable. The preparation wasn't complicated, but it was attentive. Oats were stirred patiently so they wouldn't stick to the bottom of the pot, a wooden spoon moving in circles while steam curled upward. Once ladled into bowls, the porridge was finished with a ribbon of cane syrup poured across the top. Unlike the artificial sweetness of modern instant flavors, cane syrup carried depth. Smoky, earthy, almost caramel-like, with a lingering bite that cut through the blandness of oats. Some added a pat of butter to melt into the grains, others a sprinkle of cinnamon, but the syrup was always the star. For children, oatmeal with cane syrup was a morning comfort. even if they didn't realize at the time how rooted it was in necessity. It was inexpensive, easy to stretch across a large family, and hearty enough to last through hours of school or work. Adults appreciated it for the same reasons, though they also knew it represented a connection to the land and to traditions of making do with what was at hand. Today, instant oatmeal dominates grocery store shelves, dressed up in flavors from maple brown sugar to strawberries and cream. Yet none of them carry the richness of cane syrup, the taste of slow mornings, and the reminder that real sweetness comes from patience and place. Fried catfish. Breakfast sandwich. The fried catfish breakfast sandwich was never meant to be glamorous, yet it carried a kind of down-home charm that made it unforgettable. In African American kitchens across the South, catfish was both abundant and affordable, often pulled straight from rivers and ponds by family members who fished not for sport but for supper. Breakfast might sound like an odd time for fish, but when you had fresh catch on hand, there was no waiting until dinner. Fried crisp and tucked between slices of bread or a warm biscuit, catfish became the centerpiece of a morning meal that was hearty, practical, and delicious. The preparation was simple and familiar. Fillets of catfish were dredged in seasoned cornmeal, salt, pepper, maybe a shake of paprika or cayenne for heat, before being slipped into hot oil. They emerged golden and crunchy, the kind of crispness that crackled audibly when bitten. While the fish rested, the bread was readied. Thick slices of loaf bread, often homemade, or leftover biscuits split in half. A smear of mustard, a drizzle of hot sauce, or even a spoonful of molasses could be added depending on the household. When pressed together, the sandwich was messy, satisfying, and portable. The kind of breakfast you could eat on the way to work or in the field without ceremony. For those who grew up with it, the fried catfish sandwich wasn't just food, it was memory. It meant early mornings on the riverbank, evenings cleaning fish by lantern light, and kitchens where frying oil was never far from the stove. Today, catfish still appears on Southern menus, but more often as a dinner platter than a breakfast staple. Yet the sandwich stands as a reminder of how African American cooks turned whatever was available into a meal worth savoring, no matter the hour. Cornmeal dumplings and milk. Cornmeal dumplings and milk may not sound like much to modern ears accustomed to parfaits and lattes, but for African American families of earlier generations, it was a warm and reliable breakfast born from thrift. Cornmeal was the backbone of so many meals, cheap and filling, and with a little creativity, it could be stretched in endless directions. Dumplings made from cornmeal, flour, salt, and just enough water or lard to bind were dropped into simmering milk, softening as they cooked and thickening the liquid into something closer to a porridge. The result was a dish that was part soup, part stew, and all comfort. The preparation carried its own rhythm. Milk, often fresh from a cow or diluted with water if supplies were low, was brought slowly to a simmer in a heavy pot. Dumplings, shaped quickly by hand or spoon, were slipped in one by one, dissolving slightly at the edges while keeping their tender body intact. Sometimes a spoonful of sugar or molasses was stirred in for sweetness. Other times the dish stayed plain and savory, depending on the day and what the family had on hand. It was flexible, forgiving, and always filling. For children, this breakfast was a balm against cold mornings, something that warmed from the inside out. For adults, it was practical fuel, providing enough energy to face long hours of work without demanding costly ingredients. The texture, soft dumplings floating in thickened milk, was the kind of humble richness that could never be replicated by boxed cereals or quick mixes. Today, cornmeal dumplings in milk have nearly disappeared from American tables, overshadowed by instant breakfasts and sweet pastries. Yet the dish remains a reminder of how simple ingredients, treated with care, could create meals that were both nourishing and memorable, turning scarcity into sustenance. Collard green hash with eggs. Sometimes collard green hash with eggs was one of those breakfasts that blurred the line between necessity and indulgence. In African American households, collard greens were ever present, often simmered low and slow the night before with onions, peppers, and a bit of smoked meat if the family could spare it. By morning, leftovers rarely went untouched. Instead, they were reborn in the skillet, chopped fine and fried with potatoes or cornbread crumbs to create a rustic hash. A few eggs cracked on top transformed it into a meal hearty enough to carry someone through the day. The beauty of the dish was in its improvisation. Greens from dinner mixed seamlessly with starches from yesterday's table, everything crisped together in the same cast iron skillet. Once the hash sizzled and browned, eggs were added, sometimes scrambled in, sometimes laid whole over the top to fry in the sizzling fat. The yolks ran golden into the greens and potatoes, turning the hash into a kind of savory mosaic. Hot sauce was never far away, and neither was a biscuit or wedge of cornbread to scoop it all up. What made collard green hash with eggs memorable wasn't just taste, but the feeling it carried. It was food that spoke of thrift, of refusing to waste even a leaf. But it was also food that tasted better the second time around. Children might remember wrinkling their noses at collards during dinner, only to devour them happily when paired with eggs at breakfast. Adults saw it as a practical kind of comfort, one that proved leftovers could be more exciting than the original dish. Today, hash shows up on brunch menus with pulled pork or truffle oil, but collard green hash with eggs rarely makes the cut. Still, it stands as a soulful, unpretentious dish, born of resourcefulness and rooted in tradition. Cow tongue and biscuits. Cow tongue and biscuits may sound like an odd pairing to modern ears, but in African American kitchens of the past, it was a breakfast that embodied resilience and thrift. Cow tongue, though not a prized cut in wealthier households, was often available cheaply or handed down as part of the less desired portions of the animal. With care and patience, it became a delicacy in its own right, tender and flavorful when simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and spices. Once cooked, it was sliced thin, its rich, beefy taste rivaling more expensive cuts, and served alongside biscuits that were flaky, warm, and fresh from the oven. The preparation took time, which meant it was often reserved for special mornings or weekends when families could afford to linger. The tongue would be boiled until tender, the outer skin peeled away to reveal meat that was surprisingly soft. Sliced and sometimes seared in a skillet, it was layered inside or alongside biscuits, occasionally topped with gravy or drizzled with molasses. The combination of buttery bread and savory tongue was comforting and hearty, the kind of meal that filled stomachs and quieted complaints of hunger for hours. For those who grew up with it, cow tongue and biscuits carried the weight of memory. It was the taste of family gatherings, of kitchens where nothing went to waste, and of cooks who could coax richness from ingredients others overlooked. Children might have balked at the name, but once they tasted it, many never forgot the tenderness or the flavor. Today, cow tongue has been rediscovered in global cuisines, from tacos de lengua to French delicacies, but it's rarely seen on American breakfast tables. Yet paired with biscuits, it remains a testament to a time when resourcefulness turned the unexpected into the unforgettable. Cabbage and salt pork stir-fry with cornbread. Cabbage and salt pork stir-fry with cornbread was never written into glossy cookbooks, but it lived in the kitchens of countless African-American families where necessity shaped the menu. Cabbage and salt pork stir-fry with cornbread. Cabbage and salt pork stir-fry with cornbread was never written into glossy cookbooks, but it lived in the kitchens of countless African-American families where necessity shaped the menu. Cabbage, cheap and abundant, could stretch across multiple meals, and salt pork, salty, fatty, and long-lasting, was the flavor base that transformed humble vegetables into something deeply satisfying. Paired with a skillet of fresh cornbread, the dish became a hearty breakfast, filling enough to sustain long hours of work and comforting enough to make scarcity feel like abundance. Preparation began with rendering the salt pork, the sizzling fat releasing a fragrance that would fill the house before the cabbage ever hit the pan. The pork itself crisped into chewy, savory bites, while the grease provided just enough richness to soften the shredded cabbage. Cooked quickly, almost like a stir-fry, the cabbage wilted into tender strands, absorbing the smoky, salty flavor and caramelizing at the edges. Seasonings were simple: black pepper, maybe a pinch of red pepper flakes, and onions if they were on hand. But the result was layered with flavor. The cornbread, baked in a cast iron skillet until golden and crackling at the edges, was the perfect companion, ready to soak up the juices left behind. For many, this breakfast was more than food. It was ritual. It was the sound of crackling fat at dawn, the sight of steam rising from the skillet, and the smell of cornbread pulling everyone to the table. Children might have grumbled at the sight of cabbage, but rarely complained once it mingled with pork and buttered cornbread. Today, cabbage and salt pork rarely appear on breakfast tables, dismissed as too old-fashioned for modern tastes. Yet the dish lingers as a reminder that creativity and thrift once turned the simplest ingredients into meals that nourished both body and memory. Fried bologna and cheese biscuit. The fried bologna and cheese biscuit might not have the elegance of eggs Benedict or the photogenic charm of an avocado toast, but it was once the crown jewel of quick, hearty breakfasts in African-American households, especially during the 1960s and 70s. Bologna was inexpensive, easy to find, and endlessly versatile. When fried in a skillet, the pink slices curled at the edges and crisped into something smoky and savory, transforming an ordinary cold cut into a hot, satisfying centerpiece. Paired with a slice of cheese and tucked into a warm biscuit, it became a breakfast sandwich that could stand up to the hungriest appetite. Preparation was as unfussy as the ingredients themselves. A slice or two of bologna went straight into a cast iron skillet. No oil needed since the meat carried its own fat. The sizzling would fill the kitchen with an unmistakable aroma, one that clung to the air long after the meal was over. Once browned, the bologna was stacked on a biscuit, homemade if there was time, canned if there wasn't, alongside a square of American cheese that melted into gooey perfection. Sometimes mustard or hot sauce was added, sometimes nothing at all. It was portable, quick to assemble, and so filling that it became a favorite for school mornings and workdays alike. What made this sandwich memorable wasn't just the taste, but the context. It was food for busy families, for mornings when money was short, but breakfast still had to be made. Children loved it for the salty richness, adults loved it for its practicality, and everyone agreed it was better than anything you could buy pre-packaged. Today, fried bologna carries a kind of retro nostalgia, rarely seen on menus but always remembered with a smile. The biscuit sandwich version stands as a reminder that simplicity and ingenuity once ruled the breakfast table. Cold rice and evaporated milk. Cold rice and evaporated milk was one of those breakfasts that proved a meal didn't have to be hot to be hearty. In African American households where frugality was a daily practice, leftover rice was too valuable to throw away. Instead, it found new life the next morning, poured into a bowl and covered with sweetened evaporated milk, sometimes with a sprinkle of sugar or a drizzle of syrup to finish it off. It was simple, inexpensive, and filling. A breakfast that could be made in minutes without lighting the stove. The process was straightforward. Take the rice from last night's supper, whether fluffy or clumped together, and spoon it into a bowl. Open a can of evaporated milk, rich and slightly caramel in flavor, and pour it over until the rice was swimming. Depending on the household, this could be eaten plain or dressed up with a touch of cinnamon, nutmeg, or even molasses. Served cold, it was refreshing in summer, especially for children racing out the door, but it was just as welcome year-round when time and resources were short. For many families, this dish was less about culinary finesse and more about memory. It was the taste of early mornings before school, of grandmothers who believed nothing should be wasted, of kitchens where canned milk was a trusted staple. The creamy sweetness softened the plainness of rice, creating a comfort food that stuck in the mind as much as it did to the ribs. Today, it might sound like a cousin to rice pudding or cereal with milk, but cold rice and evaporated milk has nearly vanished from breakfast tables. Yet it remains a quiet testament to thrift and imagination, reminding us that with a little sweetness, even yesterday's leftovers could start the day with comfort. Chicken neck and rice stew. Chicken neck and rice stew is the kind of dish that proves nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. In African American households where every scrap of an animal was valued, chicken necks, bony, overlooked, and often discarded by others, were transformed into a rich, sustaining breakfast with the help of a pot of rice. What might have seemed meager to some became, with patience and seasoning, a meal that could warm the body and quiet hunger for hours. The preparation started with cleaning and simmering the necks, often alongside onions, celery, garlic, and whatever herbs or spices were available. Though small, the necks carried immense flavor, releasing it slowly into the broth as they cooked. Rice was then added, absorbing the savory liquid and creating a dish that was closer to a stew than a soup. Thick, fragrant, and filling. The meat from the necks, though sparse, was tender and flavorful, often picked carefully from the bones and stirred back into the pot. A splash of hot sauce or a shake of pepper at the end gave it the kick that turned it from simple sustenance into true comfort. For families, this stew wasn't just about food, but about tradition and care. It was often made in large pots, feeding many mouths from just a handful of ingredients. Children might have laughed at the idea of eating just necks, but they remembered the taste, the warmth of the broth, and the love in the cooking. It was a dish tied to mornings when nothing could be wasted, and yet everything could be turned into something satisfying. Today, chicken necks rarely make it into American shopping carts, yet dishes like this reveal a deeper truth. That thrift and patience can coax greatness from the humblest of beginnings. Fried pig's feet with hot biscuits. Fried pig's feet with hot biscuits was the kind of breakfast that demanded time, patience, and an appreciation for flavors that came from the whole animal. In African American kitchens, especially during times when no part of the hog could be spared. Pig's feet were treasured for the rich, gelatinous meat that clung to the bone. What others might have discarded, resourceful cooks turned into a dish that was both sustaining and deeply comforting, pairing it with biscuits that came hot from the oven, ready to soak up every drop of flavor. The process began with a long boil. Pig's feet had to be simmered for hours, often with onions, garlic, and a few spices, until the tough cuts turned tender and infused the broth with a savory depth. Once softened, they were dredged lightly in flour or cornmeal and slipped into hot grease, frying until the skin crisped and the meat beneath stayed succulent. The contrast of textures, crunchy outside, silky inside, was what made the dish memorable. Served alongside biscuits, flaky and steaming, it became a meal that was equal parts rustic and indulgent. For families, fried pig's feet were more than just food. They were a reminder of how nothing went to waste, and how even the most humble ingredients could be transformed into something worth gathering around. Children might wrinkle their noses at the bones, but they often found themselves reaching for seconds once the flavor hit their tongues. Adults appreciated it as fuel for a long day, but also as a comfort that tied them to memory and tradition. Today, pig's feet rarely appear on breakfast menus, tucked away as a relic of old-fashioned cooking. Yet fried pig's feet with hot biscuits remains a dish that speaks of resilience, creativity, and a flavor so deep it lingers long after the plate is cleared. Molasses milk. Molasses milk was one of those breakfasts that could only have come from a place where thrift and sweetness needed to live side by side. It wasn't elaborate, it wasn't flashy, but for countless African American families, it was a staple that offered comfort in a glass. At its core, molasses milk was exactly what it sounded like. Whole milk stirred with a generous spoonful of molasses until the liquid turned a warm caramel brown. Cold or warmed on the stove, it was breakfast for children rushing off to school, or for adults needing quick sustenance before work in the fields or the factory. The preparation could be as quick as opening a jar and pouring. Molasses, thick and dark with that unmistakable earthy sweetness, dissolved slowly into the milk, leaving ribbons of gold and brown that swirled together before settling into harmony. Some families preferred it warm, a stovetop version that felt almost like hot cocoa without the chocolate. Others drank it chilled, refreshing and rich. A poor man's milkshake before milkshakes were ever a thing. The flavor was bold, smoky, and slightly bitter, balanced perfectly by the creamy base of the milk. Molasses milk carried more than taste, it carried memory. It was the drink that soothed growling stomachs when money was short and groceries were thin, yet it felt like a treat because of its sweetness. Children often remember sticky spoons clinking against glasses, and parents knew it would keep little bellies satisfied until the next meal. It was practicality disguised as comfort. Today, molasses milk is almost unheard of, overshadowed by protein shakes and flavored lattes. Yet it deserves recognition as a forerunner of all those functional drinks. It was simple, nourishing, and deeply tied to the rhythms of life. Proof that even a glass of milk could tell a story. Bread pudding made from day-old biscuits. Bread pudding made from day-old biscuits was a dish that turned frugality into something that felt downright indulgent. In African American kitchens where nothing was wasted, yesterday's biscuits, too hard to split open and butter, too dry to sop with syrup, found a second life in a baking dish. With a little milk, a few eggs, sugar, and whatever flavorings the pantry allowed, those forgotten biscuits became soft again, transformed into a custardy pudding that filled the kitchen with warmth and sweetness. It was proof that thrift and creativity could walk hand in hand and come out tasting like dessert at breakfast. The preparation was deceptively simple. Biscuits were crumbled or torn into chunks, then soaked in a mixture of milk and eggs until they surrendered their dryness and absorbed the liquid. A handful of raisins, a drizzle of molasses, or sprinkle of cinnamon might be added if such luxuries were available. The mixture was poured into a greased pan and baked until puffed and golden, the edges crisping while the center stayed tender and custard-like. Served warm, often with nothing more than a pat of butter or another drizzle of syrup, it was a dish that felt rich even when it was built on scraps. For many families, this kind of bread pudding carried emotional weight. It was a reminder of resourcefulness, of mothers and grandmothers who could coax comfort from the simplest ingredients. Children remembered it as a treat, something special to wake up to, even though it was born out of necessity. Adults appreciated that it stretched the food budget while filling the house with the smell of baking sweetness. Today, bread pudding is served in restaurants with fancy sauces and gourmet twists, but its roots lie in humble kitchens. Day-old biscuits reminded families that even the leftovers deserved a little love. Stewed prunes and biscuits. Stewed prunes and biscuits may sound like the kind of breakfast your grandmother might force on you, but for many African American families of earlier generations, it was a dish rooted in practicality and quiet sweetness. Prunes, dried plums, were affordable, easy to store, and could be bought in bulk, making them an ideal pantry staple in households where fresh fruit wasn't always available. When simmered slowly with water, sugar, and maybe a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg, the prunes softened into a rich, syrupy stew that turned humble biscuits into a breakfast worth remembering. The preparation was as straightforward as it was comforting. Prunes were placed in a pot of simmering water and cooked until they plumped and released their natural sweetness. Some cooks added a spoonful of brown sugar or molasses to deepen the flavor, while others kept it simple, letting the fruit speak for itself. Once ready, the prunes were spooned over hot, flaky biscuits fresh from the oven, the thick juices soaking into the crumb and creating a contrast of tart, sweet fruit and buttery bread. The combination wasn't just filling, it was downright cozy, a reminder that breakfast could be both thrifty and indulgent. For children, stewed prunes often carried mixed feelings. The name alone made some wrinkle their noses, yet the sticky sweetness was hard to resist once tasted. For adults, it was nourishment and comfort, a way to provide fruit when fresh produce was scarce or too expensive. The dish carried the rhythm of resourcefulness, the ability to transform a shelf-stable item into something warm and memorable. Today, stewed prunes are more likely to be mentioned as a health food than a breakfast treat, and biscuits are often grabbed from a drive-through bag. But together, they remain a testament to kitchens where ingenuity and love made even the simplest foods shine. Cornbread and buttermilk in a glass. Cornbread and buttermilk in a glass might sound unusual today, but for many African American families, it was a beloved breakfast, snack, or even supper. A dish that blurred the line between eating and drinking. It was born from thrift and ingenuity, a way to use up stale cornbread while turning plain buttermilk into something hearty and sustaining. At its heart, it was simple. Crumble leftover cornbread into a tall glass, pour over tangy buttermilk, stir just enough to soften, and eat it with a spoon. What could have been food waste instead became comfort in its purest form. The preparation required no stove and no fuss, just yesterday's cornbread and a jug of buttermilk, often homemade or soured naturally on the counter. The cornbread, dry and crumbly on its own, softened instantly in the liquid, transforming into something almost porridge-like. Some preferred it plain, savoring the tart bite of the buttermilk against the mellow corn. Others added a drizzle of molasses, a spoonful of sugar, or a pinch of salt to make it their own. No matter the variation, it was filling, cheap, and quick. Qualities that made it indispensable in working households where mornings moved fast. For many, this dish wasn't just sustenance, but a memory of community and kin. It was what you ate at your grandmother's table late at night, what you whipped up after a long day in the fields, or what carried you through a morning of chores. It was as unpretentious as food could get, yet deeply satisfying in its simplicity. Today, cornbread and buttermilk in a glass is rarely seen outside of memory or nostalgia. But in an era obsessed with overnight oats and yogurt parfaits, it stands as an early, unpolished version of the same idea, practical, nourishing, and timeless in its ability to comfort. And there you have it, 30 breakfasts once common in African American kitchens, now nearly forgotten, but still full of history, comfort, and creativity. These dishes weren't just about filling bellies. They were about survival, love, and making the most out of what was on hand. If any of them sparked a memory or made you curious enough to try them yourself, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves food history, and subscribe for more journeys back to the flavors that shaped us.